pounding, pulsating rhythm of a train upon a track. The shrill cry of a distant whistle has always awakened thoughts of anticipated excitement and adventure. For some, it recalls memories as fresh as new-mown hay. For some, it pushes back the cobwebs and dark shadows of time, and for others, it is just a dream, something never heard nor actually seen. The mournful whistle seems to reinforce the sadness of a passing era, a colorful period in our heritage that may never come again. Such is the story of the First Transcontinental Railway, a story so vast that we can only touch upon its true significance in this short space of time. The scenes that will be witnessed were taken from the original photographs and a retracing of the original transcontinental route 100 years later. The idea of a transcontinental passage had entered some minds with the development of the locomotive in the 1830s. But it wasn't until 1853 that Congress became sufficiently interested to allow the exploration of various route possibilities. The issue became enmeshed in the great debate over slavery. Southerners, naturally, did not want a northern or central route, as this action would guarantee additional free states. Northern interests were equally concerned that a southern route would place the rich state of California and perhaps the entire West in a coalition with the slave states.
Theodore Judah, a young engineer who had built California's first railroad, was also intensely interested in the possibilities of a transcontinental route. Through his studies, he had decided that the Mormon Trail would be the most feasible. However, he had not determined a way across the high Sierra Nevada mountains, but felt that a gateway could be found with exploration. In 1857, Judah launched a campaign with his own meager funds to see the venture completed.
In 1859, Abraham Lincoln, then an Illinois lawyer, while on personal business in Council Bluffs, Iowa, had called upon another young engineer by the name of Grenville M. Dodge. Dodge had been instrumental in the 1853 railroad surveys along the old Mormon Trail route. Lincoln was interested in Dodge's views of a transcontinental railroad and was thoroughly impressed with his knowledge. Dodge also recommended the Platte Valley or Mormon Trail route.
In 1860, Theodore Judah received a letter from Daniel Doc Strong, a druggist who lived in Dutch Flat, California, at the base of the Great Sierra Nevada mountains. Dutch Flat remains as unencumbered by civilization now as it did 100 years ago. Strong had heard of Judah's interest in finding a way across the mountains, and in his letter informed Judah that he had found such a way. The road would essentially follow the trail of the ill-fated Donner Party of 13 years earlier. This was the only route that did not involve crossing at least 2 summit ridges. However, it would demand a gargantuan effort as far as construction was concerned. The eastern slope would be a little easier, as the Truckee River cut a natural path through the mountains and descended rather leisurely to the flat Truckee meadows below. Judah and Strong drew up articles of association and began a quest for the necessary funds to start surveys. The contributions were small, and enthusiasm for the project even less. After a rather fruitless public meeting in Sacramento, Judah was invited to discuss the matter further with Collis P. Huntington, a wealthy hardware merchant. From this meeting, the Central Pacific Railroad Company was organized in Sacramento on June 28th of 1861. Leland Stanford, later founder of Stanford University and a grocer who had become governor of California, was elected president. He was extremely gifted in the area of public relations and brought this talent to the young company. Collis P. Huntington had a tenacity and sharp sense of profit that were essential to the organization. He became vice president. Mark Hopkins, Huntington's business partner, who had a tight fist where money was concerned, was appointed secretary-treasurer. And Charles Crocker, who was a successful dry goods merchant with an unbounded amount of energy, confidence, and an uncanny ability to lead men, was named head of construction. These men later became known as the Big Four. In a project such as this, there were disagreements, of course, but they were never permitted to bloom into a feud. To an amazing extent, each man accepted the will of the majority and used his own natural ability to move the construction forward. It was this precision that kept the Central apart from many of the woes that the Union Pacific was to suffer. Judah was appointed chief engineer and also head lobbyist for the company. Largely due to his personal efforts and by the repeated urging of President Lincoln, Congress passed the Railroad Enabling Act of 1862. The act provided that the Central Pacific would build eastward from Sacramento, and the still-to-be organized Union Pacific Railroad and Telegraph Company would be built westward from Omaha. Other provisions gave the railroad a 200-foot right-of-way over public land on the most direct route, 6,400 acres of land within 20 miles of the line for every completed mile of track, and low-interest 30-year government bonds as a subsidy. The bonds were issued at a rate of $16,000 a mile east of the Rockies and west of the Sierras, $48,000 a mile where the going would be difficult across both mountain ranges, and $32,000 a mile on the high barren plateau that separates both sets of mountains. As generous as these terms seem, they proved most inadequate and resulted in much shady financial dealing by both companies in their quest for funds. The railroad had been scheduled for completion by July 1st, 1876, but due to the keen competition for land and government subsidies, the line was completed some 6 years ahead of schedule.
The Union Pacific did not have an established company as did the Central. Therefore, Congress arranged to set up stock shares, and after 2,000 shares were sold, a company was to be organized with a board of directors and elected officers. Thomas C. Durant, a railroad speculator and former doctor, began to buy up shares in large amounts. As individuals were limited to a certain number of shares, it became necessary for Durant to acquire additional stock by rather dubious means. Through careful manipulations, Durant was to be elected vice president and general manager, the actual head of the company. He engaged Peter Day as chief engineer and Samuel B. Reed as head of construction. He had tried to persuade young Grenville Dodge to leave the Army and serve as chief engineer, but had been flatly turned down.
After many delays, the Central finally began construction on January 8, 1863 in Sacramento. It had rained very hard for several days prior to the groundbreaking, and the entire street was a quagmire of mud. Governor Stanford attempted to throw the first shovelful of earth onto the future roadbed and was dismayed to see it sink slowly beneath the sea of goo. At the conclusion of the ceremony, Charlie Crocker spoke.
The talk is through, and now the labor comes. A pile driver is now, while I am talking, driving piles for the foundations of the bridge across the American River. It is going right on, gentlemen, I assure you.
Although the original bridge no longer exists, the American River is still crossed by railroad track. The river is large, and the thought of driving piles with a little 10-horsepower engine is almost incomprehensible. By October 26, 1863, the first rails were ready to spike. The new-fledged company had already met many challenges. Heretofore, the standard gauge width had been 5 feet. On recommendation of Congress, this had been changed to 4 feet 8.5 inches, necessitating the remaking of the undercarriages on all rolling stock at the cost of much time and money. Theodore Judah, since the beginning, had been opposed by the other members of the company. They were interested in immediate profit, and he was interested in completing the road in good order. Due to this conflict, the young visionary was forced from the company. On his way to New York City to acquire the necessary funds to buy out the other members of the company, he contracted yellow fever. 5 days after Charlie Crocker had spiked down the first rails in California, Theodore Judah died in New York City. On November 9th, the small engine, the Governor Stanford, rolled down 2 miles of track, and the great race had begun. Samuel S. Montague, Judah's engineering assistant, was advanced to the position of chief engineer, a post he held until the completion of the route. If he could have foreseen the difficulties that lay in his path, chances are that the Central would never have been built. By mid-year of 1864, the track had extended itself to Roseville, 18 miles from Sacramento, and already the hard construction had started. With picks and shovels, a fill 1,000 feet long and 60 feet deep was completed at Newcastle, and work was started on Bloomer Cut. What had outwardly seemed a relatively simple job of cutting through a small hill became gigantic in proportion when it was discovered that the hill contained a hard cement conglomerate and necessitated cutting through it for 800 feet and to a depth of 63 feet. The work forged ahead by the inch. Even today, the track must be constantly patrolled in Bloomer Cut to prevent loose boulders from falling down the steep sides and onto the track. James H. Strobridge, a rugged New England giant, became superintendent of construction. He had acquired considerable railroading experience and brought this knowledge to the Central Pacific. Not a Puritan by any means, he nevertheless ruled over his workers with an iron hand, never allowing pleasure to interfere with the construction of the line. Drinking and fighting were not tolerated, and woe be unto the participants in such activities. Beset with money problems, the Big Four agreed to only keep men working whom they could afford to pay regularly, and contented themselves for the most part by operating the line between Sacramento and Roseville.
Meanwhile, in Omaha, things were progressing at a much slower rate. It took time for the Union Pacific to gel into anything cohesive, but gradually the company began to merge into a full-fledged working unit. Durant still had not received confirmation from Lincoln as to where the actual line was to start, and consequently went to Washington to promote Omaha as the starting point. A groundbreaking ceremony took place on December 2nd, 1863. Peter Day, chief engineer, took charge of the event, but the ceremony was almost totally ignored by personages of public import. Like its sister, the Union Pacific construction began in the middle of a muddy street with husky Indian squaws from the Omaha tribe making up the first crews. They were paid 50 cents a day, and their husbands collected. At this point, even the flat and uncomplicated prairie land of Nebraska seemed the most formidable place in the world to construct a railroad. Without funds and labor, the line moved very slowly. Durant seized upon every opportunity to control the company. He set up an independent contracting company called the Credit Mobilier of America. In the charter, financial responsibilities would be limited to the railroad should they fail. The first plot was to find a contractor to undertake a building contract, and then as planned, the contractor would fail, and the Credit Mobilier would take over construction, a practice that smacked of interest conflict and yet was not investigated by the government until after the railroad was completed. These shenanigans led Peter Day to resign from his position as chief engineer. So once again, Durant tried to persuade General Dodge to leave the Army and join the Union Pacific, but to no avail. So for the rest of 1864, the flatlands of Nebraska were left relatively untouched, and work came to an almost complete standstill.
In 1865, things began to look bright for the Central Pacific. They were to receive financial support from the state of California, and Charlie Crocker felt he had found a solution to the labor problem. Till this time, the labor force had largely been made up of itinerant men who would stick with the job just long enough to acquire a stake to reach the rich Nevada mining fields. Some Irish workers had been imported from the East, but it was an expensive proposition.
Oh, I am a jolly Irish lad, O'Shaughnessy is me name. I hired out into Section 3 to go winding on the train. Oh, they sent me out to number 10, 'twas there my duties did begin. But where in the devil they all come in, it nearly wrecked my brain. Oh, they sent me out on the upper deck, 'twas there I thought I'd break me neck. I hung onto the ring bolts till me hands and feet grew lame. Could no longer stand upon me pins, 'twas then I thought of all me sins. If God will forgive me, I'll never again go winding on the train. They wanted me to turn the switch, and I fired 2 boxcars in the ditch, and afraid he called me a son of a...
Crocker convinced Strobridge to hire 50 Chinese, much to the dismay of Governor Stanford, who had been elected on a platform of strong anti-Chinese sentiment. The objections were soon outweighed, and Stanford, with his great public relations ability, soothed the press and many of his California constituents.
Wherever we put them, they got along well. They worked themselves into our favor to such an extent that if we found we were in a hurry for a job of work, it was better to put Chinese on it at once.
Charlie Crocker's idea worked. By July of 1865, 4,000 Chinese were working for the company. Most had been brought from China, and even though they were paid a wage almost equal to the Caucasian workers, many had indentured themselves for passage to America. With one-horse dump carts and raw physical stamina, the track moved to Auburn, which today is still a stop on the line, although one of much less importance than it was 100 years ago. From here we pass through an original portal of an old tunnel and then on to Colfax, where an old hotel stands by the railroad station as a reminder of the past that is now almost forgotten. The track continues to snake around the surrounding hills upward to Cape Horn. At Cape Horn, the Chinese were lowered over the cliffs in wicker baskets to place the black gunpowder in the California granite. 1,400 feet below, the American River presents an awesome spectacle. Ahead of Cape Horn stretched the high Sierra country and miles of tunnel and special grading. Outside of Cape Horn, a giant trestle across a gorge was constructed known as the Secret Town Trestle. Today, a long earth fill is seen where the trestle once stood. At Gold Run, work was started on a small piece of construction known as Dixie Cut. During the early part of 1866, winter rains raised much havoc with construction. Several workers were killed in mud and rock slides. Construction costs spiraled upward at a prodigious rate as bad weather continued. Crocker later recalled this time as
the time when I would have been very glad to take a clean shirt and lose all I had and quit.
Spring found 10,000 Chinese pitted against the granite of the Sierras. They worked in gangs under white foremen called riding bosses. With spike mauls ringing in the clear mountain air, the track moved along to Emigrant Gap, some 8 or 9 miles east of Gold Run. Powder was being consumed at the rate of 300 or 400 kegs per day at a cost of $4 per keg. Nitroglycerin had been tried, several people killed, and public indignation at such a high level that attempts to use the explosive were abandoned. From Emigrant Gap, the line rode the low ridges to Blue Canyon, which was used later as a terminus for helper engines. Huntington, in Washington, had convinced Congress that the Central would reach the California-Nevada border in record time, and that they should be allowed to go on across Nevada. He was most successful in his appeal, and Congress opened the way. With this added incentive, Crocker and Strobridge drove their crews around the clock, aided by lanterns and huge bonfires to see after dark. By late November, the railhead had reached the little mining town of Cisco. This was to be the terminus for the winter. Cisco, 92 miles from Sacramento, would become the staging area for the final assault on the top. Ahead lay 12 tunnels and heavy rock work. With black gunpowder, the tunnel work would average 1 foot every 24 hours, working around-the-clock shifts. Cisco, a once prosperous community, is no more. One service station and a few railroad buildings, almost forgotten, mark its place upon the face of time. Heavy snows at Cisco forced the Central to build huge snow plows. To facilitate work on the summit tunnel, a locomotive was stripped down, christened the Picked Black Goose, and hauled by ox team to the summit. Here it was to be used as a hoisting engine for a center shaft, which had been dug to hasten the tunnel construction. Through the long winter, the Chinese lived underground like moles. Sometimes they had to burrow their way under 50-foot snowdrifts to reach the work site.
The Union Pacific in 1865 was at a virtual standstill. Little or nothing had been done since the groundbreaking in Omaha. Many critics vocalized loud and long against the company. 1,000 men were employed, but were not happy in their labors. Many had not been paid for several months. In August, at President Lincoln's insistence, Congressman Oakes Ames and his brother Oliver were induced to come into the company. Both men were extremely wealthy and possessed leadership abilities that Lincoln felt would move the Union Pacific into action. With the additional funds and credits supplied by the Ames brothers, things did begin to move, and in November the railroad was situated 17 miles from Omaha and picking up momentum as the work progressed. The lush, fertile prairie land began to slip quickly behind the iron trail. February of 1866 found an additional stroke of good fortune for the Union Pacific. Brigadier General John Casement, recently retired from the Army, and his brother Daniel signed an agreement to lay track for the Union Pacific. To accomplish the job, they developed the idea of a work train, complete with bunk cars, tool cars, a kitchen car, and a series of flat cars loaded with the needed supplies. It wasn't long before the Central copied this unique arrangement. To augment the work train, the Union Pacific eventually employed 10,000 men. Most were former Union or Confederate veterans or Irish immigrants. The Casements ran their outfit with rigid military discipline during working hours and consequently were able to build the line more quickly than had been thought possible. In April, Durant was finally able to convince General Dodge to leave the Army and take the post of chief engineer. The combined efforts of Dodge and the Casements were volatile enough to make the iron fly into place. And by the end of 1866, the unbelievable had become reality. 265 miles of railroad in 9 months, 65 miles in 1 month, and 3 miles in a single day were the new track-laying records. December found the entire workforce holed up in North Platte, Nebraska. The lure of accumulated cash and youthful high spirits attracted whiskey peddlers, saloon keepers, gamblers, prostitutes, and confidence men in droves. With the encouragement of General Jack, the men spent their leisure time enjoying these orgiastic pleasures. In the spring, when construction moved again, the whole town was picked up and physically moved along the construction route. These rolling parlors of sin were soon christened Hells on Wheels and followed the Union Pacific railhead until its completion in 1869.
The winter of 1867 found the Chinese in the high Sierras where the snow depth on the level was 44 feet 7.5 inches. When spring finally did come, many frozen bodies were found in the melting snow, some still valiantly clutching picks or shovels. This first winter in the mountains gave birth to the idea of building snow sheds to keep the snow off the track. Many are still in use on the route today. Ignoring the widespread antagonism toward the hiring of Chinese labor, Crocker had 14,000 at work by mid-June. The Central would ultimately have upwards of 20,000 Chinese working on the line. It has been stated by many historians that without the Chinese, the Central could never have been constructed. The indomitable Oriental spirit of persistence under adverse conditions enabled the labor force to work against the overwhelming natural and physical barriers of the High Sierra and beyond. When the Caucasian force took ill with dysentery, the Chinese continued to build. They boiled the water and consumed gallons of it in their tea, which was the reason they were able to avoid illness caused by bad water and unsanitary conditions. Daylight appeared in the Summit Tunnel on August 29th, and by the end of November, track was through. Crocker and Strobridge moved the crews down to lower levels on the eastern slope of the mountains, where winter would be more mild and work could be continued.
1867 saw the continuation of Union Pacific's success. Excursion trains were frequently running to the end of track, and former critics had now become staunch advocates. The Union Pacific, in direct contrast with the Central Pacific, had encountered little difficult terrain, but they met with another problem not experienced by the Central. Indians, mainly Sioux and Cheyenne, were bitterly opposed to the railroad coming across their lands and consequently fought many skirmishes with the railroaders. In May, the first Indian attack took place. Henceforth, every worker was issued a weapon to protect himself. The Hell on Wheels settled into Cheyenne at the end of 1867. This marked the terminus or railhead for the winter. Meanwhile, to the west of Cheyenne, work had already begun on the vast stretches of rock snow fences to protect the train from the blowing snow. Some of these snow fences still remain in the Granite Canyon area.
Crocker was determined to put down 300 miles of track in 1868. Costs were soaring and materials, especially iron rails, were difficult to come by.
The railroad from this time on was built without regard to any outlay that would hasten its completion, and could have been built for 70% less than the actual cost.
Despite the usual toll of work that needed to be redone after a hard winter, cutting and grading continued. Word was passed on June 16th that 167 continuous miles of track were connected through the Sierras. The Central, which had found the going tough early in the game as they wound over the tortuous mountain grades, now made rapid progress. The railroaders who had started as rank amateurs had matured to a high level of proficiency. They were tempered in the California granite and honed to perfection. Over the top, past Donner Lake on high, narrow grades, past precipitous overhang, and plunging at last on a dizzying descent into the little town of Truckee. Halfway down the eastern slope came the rail. In this modern age, Truckee has become the gateway to a multitude of ski resorts. Little is left which could designate it as a major railway terminal. For another 30 miles, the track continued its descent until at last Reno, at the eastern base of the Sierras, was reached. Grading crews were now flung far out in front of the track, and by mid-1868, the great railroad race was in full swing. Both companies were eager to collect as many land grants and subsidy bonds as possible. They also wanted to win the intangible but prestigious prize of having laid the greater length of track.
Tree in solid rock stands to the east of Sherman Summit in the Black Hills of Wyoming. The legend says that the rail line was deviated 50 feet to accommodate this freak of nature. In subsequent years, the firemen on each steam locomotive doused the tree with water at every passing, thereby keeping it alive. The present line is quite a bit south of the monument. As the railhead moved toward Sherman Summit, the highest point on either railroad, construction became increasingly difficult. Dodge had found this particular portal through the Black Hills while leading a cavalry attack against some Indians in 1865. All that remains of Sherman is a large, barren expanse of nothing. Deserted cemetery, incessant wind, and a huge monument, hewn out of native stone and dedicated to the memory of Oliver and Oakes Ames.
You should have seen him in the winter time when their hills were clad with snow. Oh, it was his pride on the handcart to ride as over the section he'd go. With his big soldier coat buttoned up around his throat, any dangers he would dare. And it's Patty Mac, do you want that track? While Jerry goes out of the car.
It is hard to believe that the hardy Irishmen were working on this line between January and April of 1868. The first obstacle of an almost insurmountable nature was the Dale Creek Trestle, a big bridge for a small brook that one could easily step over. The original abutments are still clearly visible. The terrifying structure swayed crazily in the strong mountain winds, and often the train crews crossed it at great peril. The guy wires which kept the bridge from twisting were nothing more than hemp rope. Most engineers on the line refused to cross the trestle at night or during a storm. From Dale Creek, the track descended sharply into Tie Siding.
Give my respects to the roadmaster, for Larry he did cry, and lift me up so that I may see the old handcart before I die. Then upon me chest let the spike mull, and the gauge and the old cloth bar. And while the boys are laying me in my grave, oh, Jerry, go I'll the car.
At Tie Siding, construction timber was hauled from nearby Boulder Ridge to be used mainly as tie material. A few old buildings and the remains of the old bank vault are the evidence left for us to ponder. Railroaders say that Tie Siding enjoyed 17 saloons in its heyday, and that many men killed in brawls lie buried in the roadbed fill. In April of 1868, the casement workforce reached Laramie.
From Reno, the Central Pacific lunged eastward and founded Wadsworth. An old hotel built to take care of passengers and railroad workers is mute testimony to another era. At Wadsworth, the line crossed the Truckee River for the last time and faced out across the uninviting waste of the Humboldt Desert.
The country afforded nothing into the construction of a railroad. There was not a tree that would make a board for the next 500 miles of the route.
The last good water was at Wadsworth, and from here eastward would be nothing but stinking alkali sinkholes and the bleached bones of animals unable to tolerate the harsh conditions. With the large flat stretch ahead of them, the repeated order was for speed.
The line we want now is the one we can build the soonest, even if we rebuild immediately.
At Imlay, the influence of the railroad remains intact. The towering tarantula silhouette of the water tank stands in memoriam to the many boilers it has fed in the hot desert sun.
Fort Saunders, on the outskirts of Laramie, provided the stage for a dramatic showdown between Durant and other Union Pacific officials. There was much ill will brooding, mostly due to Durant's behind-the-scenes intrigue and his constant interference with construction. The meeting was presided over by General U.S. Grant, then in the midst of his campaign for the presidency. Durant was roundly roasted and ordered to cease and desist. This was the beginning of the end for the colorful doctor, even though he would hang on to his association with the company until the railroad was complete. The old guardhouse at Fort Saunders is the only building of any consequence left partially standing. From Laramie, the track churned toward Rock Creek and thence to Medicine Bow, Benton, and Fort Steele. Here was the start of the Red Desert. A bridge was built crossing the North Platte, and old abutments still are visible alongside of the present route. From Fort Steele, the casement workers would struggle through knee-deep alkali dust for 70 miles. Fort Steele was to become the major supply point and last fresh water available for the length of the Red Desert.
We haul all our water about 50 miles on the cars. We are losing a great many mules. 6 nice fat ones died in less than an hour today.
Fort Steele has fared somewhat better than the other places. At least a few of the buildings have not been destroyed. The officers' quarters and the old powder house are almost intact. Alone, the fort stands a gaunt sentinel on the bank of the North Platte, waiting for progress to erode it from the earth. As the arid flat deserts swept away beneath the thin bands of steel, Dodge came to the conclusion that he must go to Salt Lake City and inform the Mormon leader, Brigham Young, that the railroad would not go through his city as originally projected, but would instead go into Ogden and then around the north end of Great Salt Lake. This was a weighty problem for the young engineer. The Mormon workforce was already at work in Weber and Echo Canyons and was sorely needed to augment Casement's crew, and to upset the apple cart was dangerous.
At the head of Great Echo there's a railroad begun, and the Mormons are cutting and grading like fun. They say they'll stick to it until it's complete. Old friends and relations are longing to meet. Hurrah! Hurrah! The railroad's begun. 3 cheers for our contractor, his name's Brigham Young. Hurrah! Hurrah! We're honest and true, and if we stick to it, it's bound to go through. Now there's Mr. Reed, he's a gentleman too. He knows very well what the Mormons can do. He knows in their work they are lively and gay, and just the right boys to build a railway. Hurrah! Woo-hoo! The railroad's begun. 3 cheers for our contractor, his name's Brigham Young. Yeah! Woo-hoo! We're honest and true, and if we stick to it, it's bound to go through. Our camp is united, we all labor hard, and if we work faithfully, we'll get our reward. Our leader is wise and industrious too, and all things he tells us we're willing to do. Hurrah!
Deeply offended, Brigham nevertheless continued his work as prime contractor for the Union Pacific through Echo and Weber Canyons. Arriving at Green River in October, Casement found the bed in good shape and a substantial bridge crossing the river. The initial abutments and supports are still used to shore up the present bridge. At Green River, the track layers put down a record 7.5 miles of track in a single day.
Strobridge and Crocker had reached the muddy Humboldt River at Golconda. The crews enjoyed the little greenery found along the riverbank, but found the thick, soupy water intolerable. Crocker complained that there was not enough large rocks to be found for adequate construction, even though rock work is in evidence along this part of the line. The Strobridge work train lumbered next down the track toward Palisades. Identified as the most difficult area of construction east of the Sierras, 3,000 Chinese had been sent here a year earlier to prepare the bed. At Palisades and Humboldt River Canyon, tunnels were again being pushed through rock. However, the going was much easier than it had been in the Sierras. For the most part, the riverbed was wide enough to accommodate both rail and river. By the end of December 1868, the Central Pacific had reached Elko. Strobridge appeared to have labor trouble, but kept tight lips, and whatever the problem was, it did not surface. It was rumored that the incident involved some Chinese opium smokers. Evidently, Strobridge was able to intimidate the offenders to such a degree that the problem was solved. However, many opium pipes have been unearthed by anthropologists digging near the old roadbed.
From Green River, the Union Pacific force passed through Fort Bridger and on to Piedmont. Some old charcoal kilns built in 1869 still stand at Piedmont. But the real significance of Piedmont was achieved several months later. Durant, on his way to the ceremony at Promontory, was stopped and held hostage by a large and hostile group of workers until $80,000 in back wages could be paid. This event was one of the prime reasons for the ceremony being held on May 10th rather than May 8th, as had been scheduled. From Piedmont, the track rose swiftly to the highest elevation west of Sherman Summit, and then dropped quickly down from the summit settlement of Quake and Aspen to a small lumber town on the headwaters of Bear River. The town has been called Gilmer or Bear Town, but to the railroaders it became known as Bear River City. As this little boom town was expected to be the winter terminal, the hell on wheels began to settle in, and the city was soon described as the liveliest, if not the wickedest town in America. In early December, a vigilante committee was formed to protect the permanent residents from the riffraff who were beginning to stifle their town. A small war ensued between the local citizenry and the grading crews. Some old accounts say that upwards of 200 people were slain. However, most historians fix the number at 17 or 18. Due to this skirmish and the ill feelings that prevailed, Casement determined to move on toward Echo Canyon. Shut out by the railroad, the little city died a lingering death and then slipped quietly into oblivion. Nothing is left of this infamous town except a small monument which marks the spot of its existence. During Christmas week of 1868, the Union Pacific tracks entered the head of the Great Echo Canyon. In Echo, the first Union Pacific tunnel was to be constructed, and ahead lay 3 or more tunnels in Weber Canyon, plus 31 trestles. To facilitate construction, a perilous 8-mile section of track was built around the Echo Canyon tunnel, and supplies were moved gingerly along this shoe fly until the tunnel was completed. By January 16, 1869, the track had reached Echo City. Many of the men were complaining of the cold, snow, and lack of money for their efforts. It was now the turn of the Union Pacific to face a bitter, grueling struggle with nature. Though not nearly as tough as the Sierra crossing, it was enough to test the strongest of men.
His name's Brigham Young. Hurrah, hurrah, we're honest and true, and if we stick to it, it's bound to go through.
While the Union Pacific was struggling through the mountains of Utah, the Central Pacific was having problems of its own. Strobridge's force was fighting a smallpox epidemic and the bitter cold of a Nevada winter. During the smallpox epidemic, many Chinese died. An accurate record was not kept, and so the number still remains in a shroud of darkness. Valley Pass was the last major summit before the Great Salt Lake Desert would be reached. From the top of the pass, the old road bed stretches out to infinity and beyond.
This part of the road was built out of chunks of ice, and when spring came, it all melted and down went the track. It was almost impossible to drive over the line without derailment.
East of Valley Pass summit, the grade descends toward Cobre and Toana. At Toana, a looted cemetery, desecrated and uprooted by antique collectors, gives ironical evidence to our 100 years of progress since the coming of the rails. Still fighting the elements, Central Pacific workers reached Montello on the edge of the Great Salt Lake Desert by mid-January. This small station on the edge of nowhere is still in use. Waiting room signs will not be seen for long, and soon Montello will be unable to stop the thrust of progress. The station doors will close and the memories of the past will fade away. By February, the weather had taken a turn for the better and the work pushed forward at an astonishing rate. J.H. Beadle described the Great Salt Lake Desert as
a valley of alkali flats and salt beds of indescribable barrenness. The spring rise of the lake covers all the adjacent lowlands, and retiring during the dry season leaves thousands of acres crusted with salt, and here and there a little pond with deposits of the pure crystal a foot in depth.
Many little stations soon dotted the wide expanse of wasteland. One of these little specks in the desert was Kelton. Not only a rail station, Kelton served for many years as the main freight depot for all ox and mule team freight outfits moving north into Idaho.
When I am dead and gone to me rest, there's one thing that I crave. Please bury me close to the side of the track with a hand cart on my grave. And when the boys go out for to fix that track with the gauge and the old claw bar, oh, I'll hear the click of the frog in the switch singing Jerry go I'll the car.
As the ground hardened, the iron bands pierced through the thick patches of sagebrush at an accelerated pace toward a moment of destiny at Promontory Summit.
Enjoying some of the best weather in years, The casement boys worked round the clock, mostly in the tunnels of Weber Canyon. The tunnels were cut in sandstone or hard clay and had to be constantly shored up with heavy timber in order to prevent cave-ins. In February, the good weather ended. 90 miles of track across Wyoming were snowbound for a period of 3 weeks. The Casement brothers almost died in the storm. They were trying to clear the track for a much-needed supply train when their own train became stalled and they were forced to walk 77 miles through a blizzard to Laramie. By the end of February, heavy construction was almost complete. The track had passed by the ominous hunk of rock known as Devil's Slide and was wending its way down Weber Canyon through 3 tunnels. On March 3rd, the graders had reached Ogden, and by March 8th, the first train had arrived. This was the largest town that the Union Pacific had encountered, and a great celebration was held. Over 1,000 miles of track had been laid since leaving Omaha. From Ogden, the going would be comparatively easy until they reached Blue Creek and Promontory Summit.
As completion drew near, there were several problems that needed immediate solution. 2 provisions of the Railroad Acts of 1864 and 65 had enabled the companies to grade 300 miles beyond the end of the track. The other permitted them, upon completion of acceptable grade, to draw 2/3 of the government subsidy bonds before the track was laid. Consequently, both companies had been grading far ahead of the actual railhead. Many areas of double grading are still evident along the old right-of-way. If Congress had decided where the 2 lines were to have met, it would have solved a complicated problem. Finally, in April of 1869, the junction point was decided upon. The joining of the rails would take place at Promontory Summit. The Union Pacific would build from Ogden to the summit, and the Central Pacific would buy that section of the line. Throughout the long campaign, there had been much friendly jousting by both companies as to which was able to lay the most track in a single day. Crocker bided his time and waited until the line was almost complete before he decided to pick up Casement's challenge and a $10,000 wager. On April 28th, Crocker gave the signal and his crew swung into action. Michael Shea, Patrick Joyce, Michael Kennedy, Thomas Daly, George Elliott, Michael Sullivan, Edward Killeen, and Fred McNamara were the elite trackers that had been hand-picked for the job. With a small army of Chinese to back them up, they were soon putting down the track as fast as a man could walk. Noon revealed that 6 miles of track had been laid. The track layers, who were to be relieved, insisted on finishing the day. In the afternoon, the grade became steeper, but the Irishmen kept at it, and by 7 p.m., 10 miles of track were down. This record set by the Central Pacific has never been surpassed. To accomplish the feat, the 8 men had lifted 985,600 pounds of dead weight during the 11-hour work period. Incredible as it seems, each man had lifted the equivalent of 5.5 tons per hour. At the end of the day, a stake was driven at the 6-mile mark of the new track, and it was designated as Camp Victory, later called Roselle. A lonely tree marks the spot.
On the other side of Promontory, the Union Pacific had moved into Corinne. Here was the last hell on wheels, a vile and wicked city where only the very strong of heart ventured into the streets after sundown. West, at Blue Creek, the Union Pacific was constructing a trestle across a deep gorge. The big trestle attracted much attention and ran parallel to a huge earth fill which the Central Pacific had constructed earlier. Eventually, the great trestle was taken down, but the earth fill overlooking Blue Creek Valley remains virtually untouched by time. In this same general area is found a large natural rock arch. This monument was dedicated to the memory of the Chinese who gave their lives for the construction of the railroad. Ironical that for those who gave so much, so little was given in return. There's not even a plaque to mark the spot.
The companies chose May 8th as the date for the joining of the track, but due to unforeseen delays such as Durant being held at gunpoint in Piedmont and several days later spring rains threatening to destroy all of the trestling in Weber Canyon, the ceremony was delayed until May 10th. May 10th found a crowd of approximately 400 to 500 persons gathered at Promontory Summit, Utah, to witness the great event. Here in this remote, barren country, 1,086 miles from Omaha and 690 miles from Sacramento, something was about to happen that would change the course of history. Engine number 60, the Jupiter, belonging to the Central Pacific, steamed in from the west. It could easily be identified by the large bell-shaped smokestack.
A short time later, the Pride of the Prairie, number 119, with a long, narrow smokestack, moved into position from the east. The ceremony was quite impromptu. General Dodge and Edgar Mills retired to figure out the order of the program, while other officials present talked among themselves. The ceremonies began at noon, when members of the Irish and Chinese workforce of each company placed the final connecting rails in place. James Strobridge and Samuel Reed, the superintendents of construction, slid the last tie beneath the rails. After an opening prayer and remarks, the two official company representatives stepped forward to the track. Thomas Durant received 2 golden spikes from California, and Governor Stanford received the silver spike from Nevada and one of iron, gold, and silver from Arizona. These spikes were placed in pre-drilled holes in the tie and driven home with a silver spike maul. The real ceremony followed. The ceremonial spikes and tie were removed and replaced with an ordinary tie and ordinary spike. Then, while the crowd waited in anticipation, Governor Stanford swung the spike maul toward the spike and missed, hitting the rail. The telegraph operator, nevertheless, took this for the signal of completion and tapped out the word "done." With the receipt of this message, celebrations began across the country.
The crowd at Promontory was no different. Amid shouts and cheers, much revelry began to take place. Bottles of champagne were broken on the front of the engines, and as the celebration progressed, some of the champagne found its way into stacks of the engines. 12:47 p.m., May 10th, 1869, the connecting line to the Pacific Ocean was a reality. As the news swept the country, Mrs. Anna Pierce Judah, a widow, left her house and walked to the cemetery where her husband had been buried. If Theodore Judah had lived, this day, May 10th, would have been their 22nd wedding anniversary. Mrs. Judah wondered if history would be kind to her husband. There was no need to worry. His knowledge and brilliance have stood the test.
100 years later, his original survey en route through the Sierras is still being used. No one has been able to find a better passage. The tent city at Promontory lived a short life and then succumbed to sagebrush and saltgrass. Durant was dropped from the Union Pacific Board of Directors 15 days after the completion of the line. Eventually, a congressional investigation took place, resulting in much bad publicity for both companies. Oakes Ames was publicly rebuked before the House Investigating Committee. He had lost a fortune and given his soul to the railroad, and to be called dishonest was more than he could stand. Several weeks later, he suffered a stroke and died. As for the others, they moved on to other ventures.
In 1903, the Southern Pacific absorbed the Central Pacific and began construction on the Lucin Cutoff across the Great Salt Lake to shorten the line. Upon its completion, the road to Promontory became a spur. Finally, in 1942, the rails were pulled up, and the old bed was left to share the desolation with the wind and a few jackrabbits. Despite incredible hardships and the ruthlessness of profit-seeking men, the job was finished. With the coming of the Transcontinental Railroad, new frontiers were opened, new industries started, and impetus was given to the very vitality of America.
I did go. I shoveled and picked in a big clay bank. I merrily cheered and sang. For my work is all you plainly see. I'm boss on the section.
Through the development of the transcontinental route, the United States of America had found its place in the sun.
A politician now, whose name and fame he does maintain, and whom all people bow. I'm the walking boss of the whole railroad, for none I care a dang. My name is Mike Kahuli, I'm the boss of the section gang. When the railroad president comes around, he takes and shakes my hand. Kahuli, you're tough, you bet you're the stuff, you're an honest working man. They never shirk when you're at work, nor at the boss will blame. They shrink with fear when I am near, I'm the boss of the section gang. Then look at my Kahuli, it's the last of him you'll see. For I must go to my darling wife, and happy we will be. Come one and all, come great and small, and give the door a bang. And you'll be welcome surely by the boss of the section gang. My name is Mike Kahuli, it's the last of me you'll see. For I must go to my darling wife, and happy we will be. Come one and all, come great and small, and give the door a bang. And you'll be welcome surely by the boss of the section gang.